Even though Mendel was able to reach two conclusions from his initial experiments, he still wanted to know what happened to traits that seemed to disappear from one generation to the next. In particular, he wanted to know if recessive factors, alleles, had disappeared or were still present in offspring with a dominant trait. Here we see that Mendel may have started with the P generation, the parent generation, with one green pod and one yellow pod, or plants, one set of plants that produced green pods and one set of plants that produced yellow pods. But when he crossed them together, all of the offspring were green. But then if he took those offspring from the F1 generation, from the first generation, and crossed them with each other, then in the next generation, that yellow trait would reappear. In fact, about 1/4 of the individuals in the F2 generation would show that yellow pea pod trait. What Mendel could conclude from this is that the yellow trait reappeared because the F1 generation must have had both green and yellow alleles, even though it only had green pea pods. Why didn't the allele for yellow color show in the F1 generation? This shows us that the yellow allele is recessive. We know that it was present, but it was masked by the dominant allele for green color. Was the recessive allele for yellow color lost in the F1 generation? And how do you know? No, it couldn't have been lost because it reappeared in the F2 generation, in 1/4 of the F2 generation. From this result, Mendel was able to infer that the factors controlling traits do not blend or become lost within an individual, but they may remain separate. This led him to conclude that when an individual produces gametes, which is the word for sex cells like sperm and eggs, so when that individual produces gametes, those distinct traits segregate or separate. They segregate and can move into another generation where they may or may not be expressed in offspring. A big question for Mendel was whether a recessive trait disappeared once it was masked by a dominant trait. Understand how to read this diagram representing crosses of plants. The P is the parent generation. So the plants in the top row are the parent plants. And in the bottom row, we see the offspring generation. F1, that means they're the first generation of offspring. Based on the diagram for this cross, which trait is dominant? Green color or yellow color? Well, it must be green color because the yellow color is masked in the F1 generation. If you only saw the plants in the F1 generation, could you know for sure what the parents' colors are? Why or why not? The answer is no. Pea plants could have one green color, or the parent plants could have one green color and one yellow color parent, or two green color parents. So we don't know, just by seeing a bunch of green, we don't know if that yellow trait is still contained in that F1 generation or not. We can only tell that by doing a cross between those offspring and creating an F2 generation. Mendel really wanted to see what would happen to traits that were seemingly masked in the F1 generation. So to address this question, he created another generation, crossing F1 plants with themselves or with through self-pollination, because he wanted to see if those hidden traits were still in the plants. He would thus produce the next generation, which he would call the F2 generation. So we see in the F1 generation, remember we had the P generation, which produced the F1 generation. And in the P generation, we had one set of plants with green pods and one set of plants with yellow pods, and all of their offspring ended up having green pods. So green is the dominant allele. Then Mendel caused the plants in the F1 generation to self-pollinate, he would take the pollen from one plant and he would pollinate a flower from that same plant with that pollen. And he would find that in the F2 generation, the generation that was produced by self-pollination, in the F2 generation, he would see that 3/4 of the offspring had green pods and 1/4 of the offspring had yellow pods. Each of these does not represent one plant, so it's not like he would only have 2 plants in the F1 generation. He would have many, many plants in the F1 generation, and so these pods really represent a ratio of the offspring. So if he had 40 plants, then 10 of them would have yellow pods, 30 would have green pods. How does the color of the plants in the F1 generation compared to the colors of the plants in the F2 generation? Well, all the plants in the F1 were green, but not all F2 plants were green. What's the relationship between the P generation and the F2 generation? The P generation were the grandparents to the F2 generation. And that trait that existed in the grandparents population popped up again in the F2 generation, the grandchild plants. So when you see diagrams like this, we didn't have 2 plants and then we didn't produce 4 plants. Mendel crossed many, many plants in each generation. And so when we see 4 offspring represented here in the F2 generation, that just shows the proportion. That just shows that 1/4 of the F2 generation was yellow and 3/4 were green. So what proportion of F2 generation were, oh, this has the wrong, this has the wrong word here, but what proportion of the F2 generation were green is what it should say. Oops, I'm sorry. Well, we've got some, oh, okay. So I'm sorry. So it should say what proportion of the F2 offspring were yellow, And the answer is 1/4 of those were yellow. And what proportion of the F2 offspring were green? And the answer is 3/4 were green, because that green allele is dominant. So when we bred those hybrid plants from the F1 generation, that yellow allele re-emerged. During formation of gametes or sex cells, alleles segregate from each other so that each gamete carries only a single copy or one allele for each gene. Can you tell from this diagram what portion of the diagram represents eggs and sperm? Those are the gametes. Gamete is a word for sex cell, and the sex cells are eggs and sperm. Just like with animals, the sperm is the male sex cell and the egg is the female sex cell. When do the gametes join up again to form allele pairs? Remember, each gamete only has one allele, so they have to join up again because every plant needs to have 2 alleles for each trait. When do the gametes join up again to form allele pairs? That happens during fertilization. Fertilization, when those 2 gametes, the sperm and the egg, merge to form one cell that will eventually develop into a plant. So which portion of the diagram represents fertilization? That's where the gametes combine to form fertilized cells, and each fertilized cell has 2 alleles. Understand the results of the F2 generation. Look at the inheritance pattern. Okay, so each plant in the F1 had both alleles because they were hybrid. Remember, in the P generation, you had one purebred green plant and one purebred yellow plant. So the green plant only contributed green alleles, the yellow only contributed yellow alleles. So in the F1 generation, you have hybrids. Each plant has one dominant and one recessive allele, one green and one yellow. Then when those plants produce gametes, those gametes segregated. So half of the gametes produced by each of these plants in the F1 generation, half of the gametes produced dominant gametes, or half of the gametes had dominant alleles and half of them had recessive alleles. So then when those pollen were randomly selected and crossed with those, or when the sperm were randomly selected and crossed with those eggs, they produced gametes in this ratio that we see in the fertilization column. And so we see in the F2 generation, we see 3/4 of the plants had green pods and 1/4 had yellow pods. The color of the pods is what we refer to as the phenotype. The phenotype is the trait as it is expressed. The actual types of alleles, where we see dominant recessive, recessive, that is what we call the genotype. For each of the 4 F2 plants shown, how many kinds of gametes could each produce? Well, from left to right, the first plant could only produce one kind of gamete, dominant gametes. The middle 2 could produce 2 types of gametes each, one dominant, one recessive, dominant and recessive. The one on the far right could only produce recessive gametes. So if we did another cross, we would see a more complex distribution of genotypes and phenotypes.